Okay, welcome to Psych 101, General Psychology. Today we're continuing our lecture on memory, the second half of the memory chapter. So we're going to talk about the nature of remembering. An important thing to note about memory is that it involves reconstruction. We like to think of our memories as being some kind of recording device, right? Where we notice something, we witness something, and we think that information gets recorded, and then we just play it back when when we want to talk about it or when we have to say something about it. But that is not the way memory works at all. Memory involves reconstruction. Okay, memory is not perfect. It is actually an account of an event pieced together from a few highlights. And there's a quote there, right, in APA style. You see quotation marks around what the author said, author's last name, year, and then the page number that you can find that quote in. But memory is not perfect. We actually don't remember everything. There's a lot of pieces missing. So we actually put a lot of the pieces together. Like, for instance, let's say that you went to a party, right? When you talk to your friends about that later on, you tell the story as if you remember everything. Yeah, we did this, we did that, then we went over here and we did this. And in reality, there's a lot of things you don't remember. And you are making things up as you go along. You are making things up the way you think they would make sense according to what you think happened. Okay, this reconstruction, when you're putting together the pieces, may or may not be accurate. Sometimes you are wrong. Okay, it happens a lot. Sometimes we think that somebody told us something and it was actually somebody else. Or we think that something was on the left and in fact it was on the right. We get a lot of things wrong, actually, many times. We also tend to have a positivity bias, which means that we tend to remember pleasant events more than unpleasant ones. So we're more likely to remember something like a party that we really enjoyed than a party where we didn't have a good time. Okay, we have this positivity bias. It helps us continue to feel better about ourselves. It aids with our current well-being, right? So whenever you hear people talk, old people talk, they talk about the good old days, right? How it used to be so much better. Oh, when they were young, how they were, very popular or quite a hit with the ladies or with the men or whatever it is. And they usually exaggerate. It was not that good, okay? When your parents talk about that stuff. And even your grandparents or even older people talk about how it used to be much better back in the day. Much better in the 50s or 60s. It was not. It was worse, okay? Especially if, by the way, you happen to be a minority. It was especially bad. But even for them, it wasn't better. We didn't have the internet back then. When you needed to find something, right? You wanted to know about something, you actually had to get your butt to the library and check out books and read them. Now everything is at your fingertips. We didn't have Netflix. We didn't have lots of conveniences we have today. It wasn't better. It was worse. But we tend to think of things in the past, right, as if they were better, right? We tend to remember pleasant things and actually wasn't that good, okay? Those songs, if you're older, you remember songs from like 20 years ago, you say, oh yeah, those songs were awesome, right? They weren't as good as you think they were, okay? But, you enjoy them more because they have to do with your memories, okay? And you tend to, they help you, feel in a positive way. Let's keep going. Let's talk more about reconstruction. This is an example here. So when people recall an event, no matter what it is, an event, let's say such as a car accident, they are actually reconstructing it from memory by piecing together bits of information that may or may not be totally accurate. So let's say it was a car accident, right? And you think about it later on because you're telling somebody about it, let's say days later or even weeks later, right? The more time has gone by, the more bits and pieces you're going to lose. So you're actually going to make some stuff up when you talk about it. You're going to get some things wrong. Like there was a study that was done where participants did exactly this. They watched a film of a car accident. And then later on, they were asked about that car accident. And a lot of participants in this experiment remembered seeing broken glass because it makes sense that if there was a car accident, that there could be broken glass. But in reality, there was none, right? People reconstructed that and they got some things wrong. And that's what happens with memory every time. Our memories are not perfect. we get things wrong, right? When we reconstruct things. Here's another example that also has to do with a car accident, okay? Reconstruction, the misinformation effect. When people are asked leading questions about an event, their memory of the event might be altered. So especially when you're asked about something you remember, if you're asked about it in a way that suggests the answer, that's called a leading question, that will affect your memory. So participants watched a film of a car accident again. And this time they were asked about the speed of the car accident. How fast were the cars going? The first bar right there, the first one on the left, okay, the taller one. How fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? That question, right, infers that or suggests that they were going fast. So participants tend to remember that cars were going about that fast, which is higher than the others. How fast were they going when they collided into each other? When it's asked that way, it's a slightly different speed that participants remember. When they bumped each other, when they hit each other, when they contacted each other, right? Contacted does not imply that they were going fast, so participants tend to remember a slower speed on average. So you can see how memory can be affected by the way questions are asked. That's called the misinformation effect, because our memory is imperfect. We're reconstructing them. When people ask us about something we remember, we are actually making things up. And when we can make things up differently depending on how the question is asked. And this is something that is frequently brought up in court, okay? When somebody asks a leading question, you'll hear, if you have a good attorney on one side, you'll hear this, right? You'll hear them say, objection, Your Honor, counsel is leading the witness. In other words, they're asking the question in such a way that it suggests what the participant should actually say or what they should remember, what they should talk about. And that is affecting, of course, the testimony that they give. Let's keep going. This leads us to eyewitness testimony, right? When people are asked about something. You know, that video that I mentioned was about a car accident, right? But they can be asked about all sorts of things. Maybe a crime was committed. You know, maybe somebody stole something or, or blew up a building or something like that. And there are often witnesses and they're asked about what they remember. Sometimes these witnesses get testify in court. Turns out that eyewitness testimony is highly subject to error. There's a lot of problems with it because every time we replay a memory, every time we think about something, we actually replace the original with a slightly modified version. And that's a citation there, right? Author is Hart. Et al. Means there are others. There's 3 authors or more. And that was in 2010, right? I'm giving you examples of APA style all along the way. But yeah, every time we think about something that we recall the episode, we recall the memory, we are actually altering it, okay? We're actually messing with the original. It's like when you record over something. So you remember something, you talk about it, and when you talk about it, you actually change the memory. So eyewitness testimony is highly subject to error. And there are many examples of this, many examples. I'm just going to mention a few, okay? One is the Jennifer Thompson, Ronald Cotton rape case. Jennifer Thompson was raped by someone, and it was not Ronald Cotton. It was somebody who looked like him. And Jennifer Thompson, she said, you know, during this, I watched the documentary, that when she was being raped, she made sure that she got a really good look at the guy, right? I mean, he was right on top of her. So, I mean, he got a really good look at him to make sure that she could identify him in court later on and he could go to jail. She identified Ronald Cotton as the rapist. Turns out it was not him. How could she get it wrong? Well, Ronald Cotton looked very similar, okay, to the guy who actually raped her. But the thing is, so Ronald Cotton was basically one of the suspects. He looked like the guy who did it. And when they asked Jennifer Thompson, hey, is this the guy who raped you? Right? Was it this guy? The guy looked similar. Ronald Cotton looked similar. So she said, yeah, that kind of looks like him. And then, so the guy went, then was, locked up and then eventually had to go to court. And then when she saw him again in court, right, to try to prove the case that it was him, right? And she was asked, is this the guy who raped you? That time she said, I'm absolutely certain that he's the guy who raped me. At first it went to, I think this is the guy, and now she was certain. Here's what happened. She saw someone who looked like the real rapist. And then from that point on, she remembered the suspect as the rapist and not the actual guy who raped her. Her memory was altered. She remembered Ronald Cotton as being at the rape scene, being the one who raped her, and not the actual guy who did it. The other guy looked similar, but it was a different guy. Ronald Cotton went to prison for 10 years. And then later on, DNA evidence actually found that he was actually innocent. 10 years in prison, right? For that, right? Not funny, but yeah, 10 years, right? Because they screwed up, you know, they gave him $100,000 for his trouble, right? Now imagine, right? Losing your life for 10 years and then getting 100 grand for it, right? Hell no, that's not enough, right? But this was like in the 80s, you know, it was a lot more money back then, but still, that kind of stuff happens all the time. There was another situation where, you know, a similar one where another woman identified another guy as being the rapist. And again, she thought it was that guy, and her memory was basically altered. She was shown a picture of some suspects. One kind of looked like the guy. And then from that point on, she remembered that guy, and it was not him. I'm not saying that all women accusing men of rape are wrong. It's not, that's not true, okay? It happens a lot, and very often people are caught, and it's the right person. I will tell you this, most of the people who are in prison and jail, okay, are actually, you know, that they're accused of something, they actually did commit that crime, okay? Most of them, yes, are guilty. A lot of them are actually innocent though, but it's not like it's half of them or even 20%, but a small percentage of them. Who knows how high it is, but it's probably in the single digits. A small percentage of them are actually innocent. And the only reason they're there is because somebody said, I saw him do it. It's usually a him. I saw him do it, right? And they were actually innocent. That's the only reason that they're there. It happens a lot. Okay, but don't get me wrong. Most of the people in prison and jail actually, yes, committed a crime that they're guilty for, right? Most of the time they get it right, all right, when they arrest somebody and they convict the right person, but sometimes they get it wrong. And it happens often enough that it ruins a lot of people's lives, right? If you're looking at the whole total US, you know, prison population, you're probably talking about thousands that are in there, you know, unjustly. Okay. To minimize errors, what should you do, right? Research suggests that when it comes to eyewitness testimony, and you're asked about something, right? That first you should be asked to describe the perpetrator. First, describe who you saw, right? Give a description. And then they should give you some photos so that you can try to identify the person. And the photos should be one at a time. So you view one suspect at a time, all right? Was it this guy? No. Was it this guy? No. This guy, you know, and they show you a list of photos, not all of them all at once, but one at a time, okay? And the lineup should resemble the suspect in age, build, and race. So I'll pick on Latinos because I'm Latino, right? If it's a Latino that did it, that's about middle age like me, then they should have, you know, nothing but middle-aged Latinos in the lineup, okay? If the person really knows who did it, they should be able to point out that person from a lineup of people who are similar. And by the way, it's important that they give a description of the perpetrator first and then search photos for identification, and not the other way around. Because if they search photos first and then they give a description, they may actually give a description of someone they saw in the photo and not the actual person they remember, because memory can easily be altered. Okay, but often it has not been done like this in the past. A lot of people falsely accused, falsely imprisoned. But through research, we learn things, and hopefully they're adjusting their tactics, right, to make sure that, you know, they throw less innocent people in jail or in prison. Okay, but I'll tell you something about law enforcement. Okay, they want to make sure they catch the bad guy. And in trying so hard to catch the bad guy, they will often get people who are innocent and lock them up because they want to make sure they catch the bad guy. And they try so hard that they'll get people who are innocent. And once they have you locked up in there, even if there's evidence that could suggest that you are innocent, it will be hard to get you out. Okay, hard to get a new trial. Hard to for them not to have evidence dismissed. Remember, their job is to catch the bad guy. They make sure the bad guy gets punished, or the bad person. Yeah, some women end up in jail too, but it's mostly men. 90% or plus are men. You know, once they got you, they got you. You know, it's hard to get out. Okay, you need a good lawyer. You need a lot of people on your side to put pressure on those people, and maybe then they'll give you a new case, right? And you know, try the thing again, and maybe they'll let you out. But it's very, very hard. Okay. Here's the thing: when you are accused of something, even if you're innocent, do not give up your rights to a lawyer, because they'll tell you things like that. Oh, if you're innocent, you don't need a lawyer, right? I mean, we can just question you. Like, no, you get a damn lawyer, okay? Because trust me, it might turn out wrong for you, okay? Even if you're innocent. It happens to a lot of people. Not the majority of cases, but it happens to enough people that it's actually a big problem. Cases of sex abuse can also be controversial. Okay, when you know, someone claims that they were sexually abused, because sexual abuse often involves what we call repressed memories. We're talking about painful memories, right, that are pushed out of conscious awareness. We'll talk about how memories can be pushed out of awareness when we talk about Freud's theory. But sex abuse is controversial for many reasons. Okay, because when people actually claim sex abuse, actually they're talking about things that happened long ago, often happened to them when they were children. And those memories are often repressed because they're very painful. In other words, we don't want to think about that stuff, so we make ourselves forget it. And sometimes hypnosis is used to recover those memories. And sometimes people claim after going, you know, through hypnosis that they were actually sexually abused. Some of those memories turn out to be false recovered memories, that it turns out that it didn't happen, and that the person, in imagining a situation, which is what you do with hypnosis, you're asked to imagine something, right? Sometimes people imagine certain things, and then they think what they imagine is actually real. I'm not saying that all sex abuse cases should be dismissed and that it doesn't happen. It happens a lot. It really does. But when you undergo hypnosis or even other forms of therapy, it's very easy to implant memories into participants, into the people who are being treated, and they could, you know, believe that something happened that didn't happen. In this video there, where it says Elizabeth Loftus false memory, right? Elizabeth Loftus is an expert on false memories. A false memory is just a memory of something that didn't happen. Okay, it can very easily develop. You can very easily develop a false memory if you're asked to imagine something that isn't real, a fictitious event. And also, infantile amnesia is when basically there's poor recall of events prior to 3 to 5 years of age. A lot of sexual abuse happens when the victims are very young, and memory doesn't work very well when you're very young. The brain is not fully developed. And for many reasons like that, sex abuse is controversial. But the video there with the link of Elizabeth Loftus is a memory expert, right? It's actually a TED Talk. It might be like 20 minutes long or something like that. And she's talking about false memories and how they work and the cases she's been involved with, because she does testify as an expert witness in court a lot. And it's very eye-opening, right? A lot of things that she says, and then the way things could go wrong, and a lot of things that have happened. She talks about cases where people have, you know, have gone basically to see a therapist who have undergone some kind of psychoanalysis, which is Freudian therapy. And they're asked to imagine something, they're asked to think about the past. And sometimes people come out of that therapy basically claiming that they've been abducted, that they have been, you know, sexually abused. Some of them, you know, even claim things that are just not even possible. You know, a woman, Elizabeth Loftus talks about a woman who claimed that when she was younger, or some years ago, I don't know exactly how long ago it was, but a woman claimed that she was basically raped, you know, got pregnant, and basically, and then had the baby cut out of her belly later on, right? She claims that that happened to her, but there's no evidence that any such thing happened. There's no scars in her belly. There's nothing that could suggest that that is true. But that just comes to show you that when you ask to imagine something, when you undergo hypnosis, or you have some kind of therapy where they have you imagine things, and they talk about fears and all kinds of things, how you can imagine things and then later on believe that that actually happened to you. So a lot of weird cases that she's dealt with. Very interesting video. Usually I play it in class, but you guys can watch it on your own, given that we are doing this via Zoom. Okay, let's keep going. More about remembering. So that was about reconstruction, about false memories and things like that. Other things we need to know about memory is that memory is context dependent. What that means is that when you actually learn something, you don't only learn about, let's say, the information. The context is also stored along with the memory. So the elements of the physical setting, that is the context. They're also encoded along with the memory. If you remember, encoding is when we do something with the information to get it into memory. Okay, so let's say, for instance, that you learned a list of words, like the experiment over here that's being depicted in this bar graph over here. Let's say you learned a list of words on land, and then you recalled them on land. You were given the test, the recall test on land. That's how well participants did. And then there were those who learned it underwater. Not sure exactly how they did that, if they were in scuba gear or a submarine or something like that, or maybe under that aquarium, where they're underwater. But some of them learned it underwater and then recalled it underwater, and you can see how well they did. There were those that learned it on land and then had to remember underwater, recall underwater. They did worse. And then there were those also that learned underwater and were asked to recall it on land. They also did worse. The point is that if you're in the same situation, the same context, when you learn something, that is, if you are again tested in that same situation, that same context, you will remember things better. So info is easier to recall in the same physical setting where it was learned. And to make that clear for you, just think about this, right? If you're living in a different place now, let's say in a different house than where you grew up, if you can, go back to your old neighborhood and look at your old home that you haven't been to in years, maybe in 10 years or maybe more, right? Where you grew up as a kid. Go back there and look at that old house, look at that old neighborhood, look at the context. And what will happen is that you'll have a lot of memories start flooding back. And you'll remember how you played there and you played with this kid and what was his name and stuff like that. And a lot of things that a lot of memories that you didn't even know were there. Because the context helps you remember. When you are playing, when you are learning, when you are doing anything, and you're forming memories, it's not just information that gets stored. It's also elements of the physical setting, the way things look, and the houses and the playground, and all these bunch of things also get stored along with the memory. So those things will also help you remember what was going on at the time. So memory is context dependent. It also depends on the situation. There's also state dependent memory. Memory also depends on how you feel, your state of mind. So what we learn in one state, be it drunk or sober, may be more easy to recall when we are again in that state, according to Myers, 2012, right? State-dependent memory basically means that, if you feel a certain way when you learn something, okay, when you feel that way again, it'll be easier for you to remember that thing. There was a study that was done where students learned a list of words while they were high on marijuana, okay? Others learned a list of words while they were sober. Results showed that those who were high recalled more words than those who tested high. Those who were high when they learned the list of words also remembered more words when they tested high. So some learned the list of words while they were high, others learned it when they were sober. And then they were tested when they were high and when they were sober. Well, those who learned the list of words when they were high, they also did better on the test when they were high. They remembered more things when they were high because that's how they felt. That was their state of mind when they learned it. They did worse when they were sober because that's not how they learned the words. Keep in mind, though, that of course, being high on something or drunk or whatever it is, it's going to impair your memory. Okay, those who do best are going to be those who who learn the words when they're sober, and then who test sober. Okay, so if you want to do on your test, yes, you should not be on any drugs when you're studying, and then when you take the test, you'll do better again if you're not on any drugs. Okay, but yes, how you feel also helps you remember things. There's some images there of a spider and a snake. That's to remind me, tell you guys about another study very similar, where they had participants learn a list of words while, while snakes and spiders were present, okay? In other words, it made them fearful. Others learned a list of words when those things were not present. And those that learned while the snakes and spiders were present also did better when they were tested under those conditions again, when they were fearful. When you're scared, you tend to remember other things that scare you. When you're happy, you tend to remember other things that make you happy. It's state-dependent memory. Your feelings also affect your memory. That's the point here. If you learn something or you feel a certain way, you remember that thing better when you feel that way again. That's why a sad song helps you remember a certain someone associated with that sad song. Biology and memory. Okay, yes, memory has a lot to do with the brain. We talked about the brain before, and we mentioned how the hippocampus actually is involved with memory. Now you're going to learn some more specific things. The amygdala, which is the part of the brain that basically responds to fear and aggression, the amygdala actually helps store memories, related to fear. So yes, it activates fear, but also helps us store fear-related memories. So for instance, when you watch a scary movie, and then let's say you have a bad dream that has to do with that scary movie. So in your dream, that person who was killing people in the movie is now trying to kill you, right? That memory is becoming active in the dream, right? And turning into a dream, right? That's because of the amygdala. When you remember something that is scary, that's the amygdala. The hippocampus, we said, is involved with getting things into memory. It's involved with memory, but it's actually involved with specific kinds of memories. It's involved with declarative memories, memories that you can easily speak of, right? So like episodic memories, for instance, when you remember that something has happened to you, that you went through something, that's what the hippocampus is involved with. And recognition memories, right? Recognizing someone. So if you damage the hippocampus, you will not be able to store new memories. Things will happen to you, like maybe you'll meet someone, and then later on, you will not remember having met that person. You won't recognize that person. That is the hippocampus. If you destroy it, you cannot form new episodic memories. The cerebellum, which is involved with skilled movement, turns out it also helps store memories that are procedural memories. Procedural memories are memories that have to do with basically movements, with skills, things you do over and over again, like riding a bike, how to play the piano. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that helps you focus, right? Helps you plan, helps you control your emotions, seems to be involved with semantic tasks, recalling things that has to do with information, such as remember who the first president was, that kind of stuff. So it turns out that there's no one place where memories are stored. Memories are stored all over the brain, depending on what kind of memory we're talking about. Whether they have to do with fear, whether they have to do with things that you can put in writing, whether they have to do with episodes, whether they're visual, all those things matter. More about the biology of memory. This is just to make you guys think a little bit. Have you noticed, actually not have you noticed, but I'll just tell you, right, that the strongest and most lasting memories are usually fueled by emotion. Those things that really scared you, or that time when you were so in love, or that time when you were so angry, right? Those very emotional situations will form the strongest, most lasting memories. So the strongest, most lasting memories are usually fueled by emotion. That's why most people have very vivid memories, very vivid memories of the events and circumstances that surround the experience of falling in love. You remember your first love, right? The first time you fell in love. Maybe you remember the birth of your first child, when you got married. Those are very emotional memories. Maybe the first time you had sex, it was a very emotional thing. It was your first time, right? You'll remember those things because they're very emotional things. And it turns out that the body basically, several chemicals, right? Hormones and chemicals actually are involved in the storing of these kinds of memories. Okay, it's very easy to remember emotional things because Well, that's how the brain works. Okay, you're supposed to remember things that are very emotional. Okay, because they're important. If you don't remember things that are emotional, if you remember things that scare you, things that are dangerous, things that could hurt you, then you're not going to survive very long. But we also remember positive things like falling in love and getting married and things like that. Now we're going to talk about forgetting. We're going to talk about, how people forget and why people forget things. I'm going to tell you a little bit of history first. History about the nonsense syllable. There was somebody known as Ebbinghaus. I don't remember his first name, but Ebbinghaus wanted to basically determine how good human memory is. So he created this thing called the nonsense syllable. And you have some examples there, WOM and MUP. So basically he created 3-letter combinations. They all start and end with a consonant, and they all have a vowel in the middle. So created these nonsense syllables, long lists of them. And he studied them and tried to remember them. He studied them for a long period of time, for hours, and then tested himself. Okay, sometimes he only studied them for a few minutes, but he developed this nonsense syllables because he wanted what he, quote, considered a pure form of memory. He didn't want to learn words that he already knew. He didn't want to study words he already knew, like dog and cat and house, right? Because those would be easy to remember. So he wanted to create things that he had not seen before. So he created the nonsense syllables to study how easy it is to forget things. And you can see the graph there about how quickly his memory faded. So he learned lists of these long nonsense syllables. And if he tested himself again, let's say if he studied them for 5 minutes and then he tested himself, let's say after about 5 minutes, then he remembered most of the words, close to 100%, right? You can see at the beginning, right? That's maybe about 5 minutes there. If he tested himself about 20 minutes later, you can see that he had forgotten almost half of those nonsense syllables. An hour later, he had forgotten almost 60%. And you can see how quickly memory fades. About 31 days later, a month later, he was down to only remembering about 10% of those nonsense syllables. So you can see that memory fades over time. Yes, it does. And it fades very quickly, according to Ebbinghaus. Ebbinghaus concluded that human memory is not very good, that it's actually very bad. But this is not actually fair to study memory in this way, because these are nonsense syllables. They depend on acoustic coding and maintenance rehearsal. So what can you do to remember these nonsense syllables? Not much. All you can do is focus on how they sound. WOM and MUP, right? That's acoustic coding. And Ebbinghaus used maintenance rehearsal. In other words, he just read the words, the nonsense syllables over and over again. That's not a very good strategy. Remember we talked about elaborative rehearsal, where you can do things to basically make it so that you can connect these things to things you already know. Like WOM, you can use elaborative rehearsal, right? Each letter stands for a different word. WOM, women on Monday. All right, hey, now you're going to remember WOM. You're going to remember always, right? You can do things like that. That's called elaborative rehearsal. But all Ebbinghaus did was basically say these over and over again and just repeat them. And that's what a lot of you guys do, by the way, when you try to study for your classes. You just look at the information again and again. That's maintenance rehearsal. Not a very good strategy, which is why, you may not do very well on the exam. And even if you do well, days later, months later, next semester, you will have forgotten most of what you learned. That's not a good strategy. It's better to connect the information to things that are meaningful, things you already have in memory. Now, what is a better way then to test memory? There's a couple of other ways you can test memory. You can actually do a test of what's called recall, or a test of recognition. Recall tends to be slower. Recall is basically when you have to produce the required information by just searching your memory. So you're asked to list all the US presidents. Just write them down and you start listing them, right? George Washington, and on, right? You start listing them. Notice that will take you a long time to do, right? And it will be hard to remember all those presidents. You're not going to remember most of them, okay? Especially if you have to remember them in order. or even if you could just put them in any order, you're going to forget a lot of them. Recall is hard, and it tends to be slower. That's like on the exam when I give you a short answer question. Okay, if I were to give you a short answer question and I were to tell you like list the parts and functions of the midbrain. You have to write down different parts of the midbrain and what they do. You're going to have trouble with that. Okay, that's recall. Recognition is easier and it's faster. Recognition, all you have to do is recognize the material. So you identify the material as familiar or as being something you've encountered before. So here you have to circle the US president. So I give you a long list of names and I tell you, circle the US presidents. And you circle the ones that sound familiar, the ones you recognize. You would probably get most of them. That's recognition. It's also like a multiple choice test, multiple choice question. The amygdala is involved in what? A, fear, B, memory. Actually, it is, but okay, so the amygdala is involved in A, fear, B, sexual behavior, C, walking, D, all of the above, something like that. You'll probably be able to recognize, hey, yeah, it's fear. That one looks familiar. That's probably the answer. This image you see over here of a cartoon couple over here, right? What they're doing is they're looking at their photo album and talking about their wedding. And because they have their photo album in front of them, they're involved in recognition. The information's in front of them. And they're just asking, hey, do you remember her, right? She was at our wedding, right? If they put away the album and all they do is talk about their wedding, then that would be recall. Let's keep going. Causes of forgetting. Okay, more about causes of forgetting. Have you noticed, right, that you are better at remembering faces than names? It's very easy to remember somebody's face. Like, yeah, I've seen you before. I know you, right? I've seen you before, right? That happens a lot. But you're not as good at remembering names. I've seen you before. What the hell's your name? I can't think of it, right? But I've seen you before. Have you ever wondered why you are better at remembering faces than names? It's because one of those involves recognition, the other one involves recall. Remembering a face, that's recognition. You recognize the face. Remembering a name is recall. You have to think of the name. The name is not written on their forehead. So it's harder to remember names. Let's keep going. Other reasons why you may forget things, okay? Encoding failure. Remember, encoding is when you do something with the information to get it into memory, right? Encoding failure is when, basically you never actually encoded the information. You never looked at it long enough or did something with the information to actually remember it very well. Like there you have some nickels there. One of those is the real nickel and the other three are not. The other three are fake, you could say. Do you know which one the real nickel is? Probably not. You know why? Because you have never looked at it that close that you know exactly where everything is. But if you take one out, and it has to be a modern nickel from the 2010s, right? You'll be able to find out which one it is. I don't remember which one it is, to tell you the truth. So I'd be guessing too. But sometimes that's the problem. You're trying to remember something that you never actually really learned that well. There you are trying to remember information about the brain, and you went to lecture, but you didn't study, you didn't do anything with the information, and you actually don't know it that well. You didn't encode the information that well, and you can't remember it. That's encoding failure. You need to do something with the information, actually learn it to get it into memory. Here's a chart that tells you about other examples of things that can cause memory problems. Schachter's 7 sins of memory. That's another way to cite an APA style, by the way. If it was a memory, Schachter's 7 sins of memory, right? That's another way you can cite. Author up front and then the year in parentheses. But one of those he called transients, the first one at the top there, the sin, right? The type, the description, and example, right? One of them is called transients. It's a type of forgetting. That means the accessibility of memory decreases over time. Transience means that basically memory fades over time. An example is that you forget events that occurred long ago. Things that happened long ago are harder to remember. Memory fades over time. That's transience. Another one is absent-mindedness, type of forgetting, right? Forgetting caused by lapses in attention. You did something and you weren't paying attention, and therefore you can't remember. You forget where your phone is. You were talking on the phone, or maybe you're doing something on the phone, and then something distracted you, and you put the phone down without paying attention. And then later on, you're looking for your phone and you can't find it because you don't know where you put it. You were absent-minded. When you put that phone down, you were not thinking. You just put it down somewhere. Blocking is another type of forgetting where the information is temporarily blocked. An example is the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you know something, like you look at a picture and say, oh yeah, I know that celebrity. I know who that is. I know it. And you just can't get it out. It's like on the tip of your tongue. That is blocking. If you just settle down, calm down, relax, you'll be able to remember. Later on, when you're not even thinking about it, then the name will come to you. Oh, that's who it was, right? Misattribution is a type of distortion where the source of memory is confused. Like when you recall a dream as a waking memory. You had a dream, and then you think that actually happened to you. That's a misattribution, right? No, the information comes from a dream, not from your waking life. It could also be when you remember, let's say that somebody said something and it's actually somebody else. Suggestibility is also a type of distortion. That's a false memory that results from leading questions. That's a false memory, like where you're asked to think about something or think about something in a certain way, and then you think that actually happened. That's a false memory. Bias is a type of distortion. Memory is distorted by your current belief system. You align memories with your current belief. So you believe a certain thing, and because of that, you remember certain things. I'll give you an example, right? The president, right? Trump, okay? Those of you who are Trump supporters, who love Trump, right? Guess what? You remember a lot of positive things about Trump, don't you, right? You can tell me a lot of good things about Trump. You can't remember or tell me so many bad things. But if you hate Trump, on the other hand, you remember a lot of bad things about Trump and not so many things that are positive. That's a type of bias where we tend to remember things that align with what we believe. Persistence is the type of intrusion when you can't forget an undesirable memory. You want to forget something and you can't, like a traumatic event, right? You had a situation where maybe you were robbed at gunpoint and you thought you were going to die and you want to forget about that and you can't. And it's causing you trouble and you have nightmares or you can't sleep, right? That's a type of persistence. It could also be, post-traumatic stress disorder, from being robbed at gunpoint or being almost blown up during service, in the military. A type of persistence. You want to forget something and you can't. Let's keep going. Other causes of forgetting, interference. Okay, there's two kinds of interference: proactive interference and retroactive interference. I'll tell you about retroactive first because that one's easy to understand, because retro means old. So retroactive interference is when you forget the old material because of new material that you've learned. So retroactive interference is when you can't remember the old stuff. And you can't remember the old stuff because of something new. So you forget your old French words, right? Because you're learning new French words. As you learn more and more, you forget some of the first ones that you studied. That's retroactive interference. Or as you, as you have more and more boyfriends or girlfriends, you forget some of the old ones that you haven't seen in a while. You haven't talked to in a while. That's retroactive interference. Proactive interference is when you forget something new. Proactive is the opposite of retroactive. So proactive is when you forget something new because of the old material. So you forget something new because the old stuff is interfering with it. Like you forget where you parked your car because you parked in a different spot than before. So let's say one day you're late to class, right? And you drive to the campus and you're in a hurry, right? And you're late. So what happens, you get there and the parking lot is pretty much full. So you have to look for a parking spot and you end up finding one way out there, right? Where you usually don't park. You rush to class, you go to class, and then after class is over, you come out, let's say, after your class is over, you come out and you're looking for your car and you can't find it. What's happening is you are looking for it where you usually park. You're remembering the old material. You're forgetting the new. You're forgetting that you parked somewhere else. That's proactive interference. This would also be like, for instance, when you are with your new boyfriend, your new girlfriend, and you call them by your old girlfriend's last name or your old boyfriend's last name, and you embarrassed yourself, right? And you say, oh my God, I'm sorry I called you that, right? You're still remembering your old boyfriend or your old girlfriend, right? And you call them by that name. That's proactive interference. It happens. There's also another reason you can forget is because of amnesia. Amnesia is more serious. It's not just interference. Amnesia is severe loss of memory. Okay, and there's two kinds of amnesia. I'll start with retrograde amnesia again, because retro means old. Retrograde amnesia basically means you cannot remember the past. So with retrograde amnesia, you're unable to remember events prior to the physical trauma, prior to the thing that caused your amnesia. Could have been an accident, right, where you hit your head when you fell off a motorcycle, or brain, other types of brain damage caused by drugs, caused by, surgery, or some other thing. Okay, but retrograde means you can't remember the past, just like retroactive interference, right? Retrograde amnesia means you have severe loss of memory. You can't remember your past, right? Let's say you wake up in the hospital and you don't remember how you got there. You don't remember where you live, where you've been, meeting anybody before that. You remember nothing. That's retrograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is when you can't remember anything new. You're unable to remember events after the physical trauma. So it's like when you can't form any new memories. So in this case, you fall, you hit your head or something like that, wake up in the hospital, right? You remember, your past, you remember things, where you live, people, all this stuff. But then, let's say you meet the doctor, right? You see the nurse, stuff like that. These people are treating you, helping you, and you meet them. And then later on, hours later, days later, let's say they come by again. You said you've never seen them before, that you've never met them before. You can't form any new memories. And that's what the video is about there. There's a link there. It says the Clive Wearing video. That person's name was Clive Wearing. Suffered some brain damage and basically had severe memory loss, severe amnesia. And I encourage you to watch it. You can watch it on your own, right? But you'll see that not all memories are equal, right? He has certain kinds of memory loss, but not others, right? Remember the different kinds of long-term memories, emotional memories, procedural, semantic, episodic, right? He has problems with certain kinds of memories and not others. And he has one of these types of amnesia and not others, okay? And that is it. The rest is references, because I've been giving you examples of APA-style citations, and that's the way you would put them in your references. So I will stop there. I'm going to stop recording.